I'm your host, Sabrina Salvati. I'm your host, Sabrina Salvati.
Hello, guys. Happy Friday. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Sabby Sabs podcast. I'm your host, Sabrina Salvati. Caleb Maupin is my guest tonight. He's a journalist. He's a political analyst. He's a speaker, and he's also an author. Welcome, Caleb.
Sure. Glad to be here.
Thanks so much for coming back. I do want to share this information really quickly, you guys, because this just came through before I went live. It appears that all three men that were involved in killing Ahmaud Arbery have been sentenced to life in prison. So I did want to make sure that I shared that information really quick. Okay, so tonight, we're going to talk about Breadtube. I know some people have asked questions about this before, like what exactly is Breadtube? What's Caleb's involvement in this? What has he discovered? So Caleb, to begin, can you tell everyone what exactly is Breadtube?
Well, that's an interesting question because I had never heard of Breadtube. But the way I found out about Breadtube was I randomly got an invitation from somebody named Caleb Kane to debate somebody else named Destiny, who also goes by Stephen Bennell. And I had never heard of either of these individuals, but they reached out to me for a debate. And then I asked, some of my associates, some of my friends, I said, hey, they want me to debate some guy named Destiny, Stephen Bennell. And everyone was like, oh my God, you're going to debate Destiny? He's huge. He's all over social. I was like, oh, okay, this is a big deal. I better do it. And so I watched a few of the debates by this guy named Destiny. And I thought, okay. And I learned his style of debating, the way he debates. And I thought, okay, let's do this. And so I had this 2-hour debate with Destiny Stephen Bennell, who is a famous video game player. I guess he's the first professional video game player in history. He was a carpet cleaner from Nebraska who figured out how to make his living by playing StarCraft 2, the video game, and he figured out a way to monetize it. And he started living that way. And I guess around the time Trump got elected, he started debating conservatives. And so that's who Destiny was. And so I had this debate with Destiny in which people were he was not prepared for what I offered. I brought factual data and information with me, and he was taken aback. And then immediately, all of a sudden, my social media was just flooded with all these people, many of whom were sympathetic, but also many of whom were saying very hostile things to me. And they were coming from a leftist or socialist perspective, and they were part of this Breadtube community. So I had to find out what Breadtube was. So I went to Wikipedia. You get on Wikipedia, it basically says Breadtube is a community of people. It started on Reddit. And it's a number of YouTube channels that debunk and debate the beliefs of the alt-right or the right wing. That sounds pretty reasonable. But another key theme on Breadtube is going after people like you and I and Jimmy Dore and Jackson Hinkle and saying that because we don't march in lockstep with the standard mainstream of the left, we don't go along with the Joe Biden synthetic left, that we are somehow secretly on the right. They've cultivated this whole myth of the Red-Brown Alliance and Naz Bowles and all of this, malarkey. So that led me to start doing some investigations. And I figured, every time I would debate one of these Breadtubers, my social media would just get bigger. So I figured it was a good strategy. So I debated vaush. I started engaging with some of the content of ContraPoints and some others. And then I was approached by an unnamed source that informed me that there's an individual named Dr. Steve Hansen, who is their advisor. And behind the scenes, Dr. Steve Hansen, America's leading cult expert, is advising them. And I thought, okay, that this guy who is the leading cult expert in America, who got on TV after January 6th last year and called for a mass deprogramming of Americans. This is a guy who's been involved in kidnappings. His personal mentor was Robert J. Lifton, the top military psychologist during the Korean and Vietnam Wars. I thought, okay, the fact that they're getting advised behind the scenes by this, guy who's clearly connected to the government apparatus and has a shady past of kidnapping people and yet not going to prison, and got on TV calling for people to be basically deprogrammed from after January 6th. I thought, okay, there's a book here. So I wrote this book, Breadtube Serves Imperialism. And in the book, I basically said that it's most likely that Breadtube is getting some covert support from some section of the power elite in the United States, and possibly the intelligence agencies, because of the fact that they see the alt-right and the right wing as a threat. And they also want to make sure that no legit anti-imperialist socialists emerge as well. And so I wrote this book on that premise. Well, now, fast forward about 8-9 months, now we have the Gray Zone has come forward, and they have a smoking gun. Kit Klattenberg in Germany and Max Blumenthal have a document that shows that Abigail Thorne, who runs the Philosophy Tube YouTube channel, one of the main bread tubers, is getting covert support from British intelligence, the British Foreign Office, and from the British royal family. And she's cooperating with Valiant Projects, which is a social media and public relations firm that was involved in, whipping up the case against the Syrian government and justifying the USA and Britain arming the terrorists in Syria. So now what I speculated might be true in this book, based on the relationship with Steve Hansen, based on the way mainstream media is promoting them, based on the way that socialists and leftists don't generally blow up the way they did. Now we have proof that it is true. Breadtube is basically tied to British intelligence and the British royal family. So what I wrote in the book is pretty much true. So that's kind of how this is developed. Breadtube is a left-wing internet community. They're against Donald Trump. They're against the alt-right. But they're also against us and all of our friends, and they somehow are working very hard to convince people that people like you and I and Jimmy Dore and Jackson Hinkle and we're all part of some secret conspiracy with Donald Trump or something like that. So that's who Breadtube is. Breadtube is one section of the power structure fighting another section of the power structure and using social media to do it. And we shouldn't be surprised. This isn't particularly scandalous or shocking. All throughout the history of the United States, there have been political figures that have been supported by the elites. And during the Cold War, the U.S. government had a policy of funding socialists and communists who were against the Soviet Union and were against Cuba and were against all the countries. They had a program called the Congress for Cultural Freedom Program, where they were funneling money to Susan Sontag, Mary McCarthy. Partisan Review magazine was a socialist magazine that was started by the CIA and distributed all over the country during the 1950s. They had Der Monat magazine in Germany. They had Encounter magazine in the UK. And these were all socialist magazines that were funded and created by the CIA. Of course, it wasn't public knowledge that's who created them. It looked like it was just a socialist intellectual literary magazine, but it was being covertly supported by the US government to give people a way to say, okay, I'm against capitalism. I'm critical of US society, but I will help build the case against socialist countries. And, for example, at the time in the 1950s, during McCarthyism, the Communist Party was known for being dedicated to the Black liberation struggle. Paul Robeson, W.E.B. Du Bois, the Civil Rights Congress, they were very dedicated to the Black freedom struggle. And the U.S. government realized that was a bit of a problem. And then the Communist Party, William L. Patterson, wrote a document called We Charge Genocide, charging the U.S. government with genocide against the African American community. And the Soviet Union brought it to the United Nations and presented this document, accusing the U.S. government of genocide against Black people, exposing racism in the United States, brought it to the United Nations. So the U.S. government was kind of panicking here because that caused sympathy for the Communist Party and the Soviet Union among the Black community to rise. And they did polls. And Malcolm X was very sympathetic with Mao and with the Chinese Revolution. And in the Black community, there was a lot of feeling that especially leaders like Kwame Nkrumah and a lot of the revolutionaries, communists around the world that were fighting imperialism were allies of the Black community. So during this same period, and you can read about this in the book Finks, How the CIA Tricked the World's Greatest Writers, the CIA found James Baldwin. And James Baldwin was a Black freedom activist who was against communism. And so they immediately pushed him, and they gave him covert funding, and they sent him around to be the voice of the Black freedom movement because he was against communism. Very similar operation. There's a book called Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. And that book was promoted because that book is about racism and oppression in the United States, but it's also very anti-communist. It has kind of, I think they call it the Brotherhood, but it demonizes the Communist Party. It presents the Communist Party as kind of, being opportunistic in how it talks about racism. And that was also, got some covert support from the US government. So this is a game that they've been playing for a long time. This is a game that they play. And Breadtube is just the latest version of it. In an age when you have people, wanting to learn more information, you have great TV networks like RT, who I work for, that are giving a voice to progressive and anti-imperialist voices and exposing the lies of the U.S. State Department. We got people like Jimmy Dore and we got people like Max Blumenthal doing great work. Okay, they want to find a way that you can be a socialist and you can be critical of U.S. society, but not be a revolutionary. And so they've got Breadtube. Why should we be surprised? It's not scandalous. And the fact that their response, we have the smoking gun at this point. Okay. We have a document. All right. This is fact. This isn't speculation that they've been supported by the British government. But still, if you look at the response the Breadtubers have to this revelation, they just laugh it off. They say everyone who disagrees with them is funded by the CIA. I mean, no, we're not saying that. There's plenty of people who, follow Breadtube, support Breadtube, who just agree with it. But yes, a couple individuals in the Breadtube universe that are tied in with, the Young Turks. And yes, they have gotten propped up, it appears, by forces within the establishment. And why wouldn't they do that? I mean, there's nothing particularly ridiculous or conspiratorial about what we're saying, but that's their response. And the fact that they're responding to physical hard evidence with this, you can call it argumentium ad ridicule, or appeal to ridicule, where they don't even have a rebuttal or a response. They just go, "Oh, are you really saying that?" Years ago, there were people that said, the earth is round. And people said to them, "Oh, are you really saying the earth is round?" I mean, that wasn't an argument, was it? There were people who said that disease was caused by germs, and someone could have said to them, "Are you really saying there are these little tiny things called?" I mean, that's not an argument when you just ridicule the person. That's not an argument. So they don't really have an argument. That's what they're showing. And they're showing that we're right. And there's a number of things that have led to that. I mean, I wasn't the first person to think of this, by any means. I am the person who wrote the book about it. But I mean, many people said they thought that this guy Vaush was getting some kind of covert support. Many people looked into the background of these people and how they just kind of came out of nowhere, but yet they seem to echo the State Department line. So we shouldn't be shocked. Breadtube serves imperialism. I feel particularly vindicated because I've received a relentless amount of attacks for writing this book. But in a way, this book was kind of a trolling operation, I will say, because Breadtube, they are online all the time. And I knew, I had a feeling. I thought, if I write this book about Breadtube, right, I discovered there was not a single other book that had ever been published on Amazon about Breadtube, with Breadtube in the title. So I thought, I'll write a book about Breadtube, and I bet I can get them all to talk about it and wave it around on their streams and promote it. And they have. It's almost like they want to help me. Now they're lying about it. They're distorting the content, claiming it's all about personalities, when most of this is about their ideas. But regardless, I mean, I couldn't ask for better advertising. This was the top book on Amazon in the category of anarchism for well over 3 weeks. There was no other book in the category of anarchism that was outselling this book for 3 weeks straight. I mean, I have never had a book sell this much. I was blown away by the numbers that came in. They took the bait and they ran a mile with it, and I'm happy. And many people have read this book and they said that it really changed their perspective, gave them a new insight into what socialism is and Marxism. And so, yeah, I'm really glad I put it out. We may put out a new edition at some point with the new information in it, or maybe another book on the same topic. We shall see. But yeah, I'm really happy with Max Blumenthal, with Jimmy Dore, with Kit Klattenberg, and yeah, this is what it's all about. So that's my introduction.
Yeah, I want to share that article really quick. I want to read a brief part from this. Now, this is the article that the Gray Zone put out, and I saw Max Blumenthal was on Jimmy Dore, and he was talking about this article, and I was like, wait, what is this about? So there's Abigail Thorne right there. There's a picture of her, and it says here that leaked documents have revealed a state-sponsored influence operation designed to undermine critics of the British government's I got to be careful with the words on here, covert Caleb. The British government's 1-9 policies by astroturfing a prominent founder of the Breadtube clique of anti-fascist YouTube influencers. And it goes on to say the project aims to conduct psychological profiling on British citizens dissenting against policies such as mandatory vaccination and lockdowns, then leverage the data to establish a YouTube channel that portrays these critics as dangerous super spreaders of disinformation. So I'll put the link to this article in the chat. If you haven't read this, you really need to read it. Because they go into a lot here. Let me go ahead and copy this link and put this in the chat. But it also says here, since launching PhilosophyTube in 2013, Abigail Thorne's YouTube channel boasts over 7,000 paying Patreon fans and well over 1 million YouTube subscribers. By probing complex philosophical and political issues in a highly accessible, engaging manner and deploying elaborate artisanal audio and visual effects, she has emerged as a social media celebrity. So I'm going to put this in the chat really quick. For those who don't know, when Caleb mentions people that just kind of came out of nowhere, like, you don't grow that fast. Like, you you don't, especially like independent media is heavily suppressed on YouTube, more so than it was probably like 3 years ago. That's why it's so hard to find us. That's why I tell you, if you're new, put in the comment section to let me know how you found me, because it's not easy to find us now. And so the fact that there are people out there that just blew up like that quickly, that doesn't even work with the algorithm. So they're getting some help.
Yeah, from outlets like the New York Times, which has profiled some of them, the New Yorker magazine, which has also promoted them. And look, I mean, I've been going to socialist and communist conferences in the United States for years. I went to the Left Forum every year. I was at Occupy Wall Street. I never met any of these people. No one had ever met these people. Like, these people, they just out of nowhere, though, they emerged to be like the voices of the anti-capitalist Marxist leftist movement. I had never met any of these people, never heard of them. None of them have any history with any communist group, anarchist group. A lot of them are members of Democratic Socialists of America, but that's like, you can just sign up on the website. Like, it's people question whether they've ever even been to meetings of Democratic Socialists of America, but they all just kind of out of the blue, they emerged, and they all kind of have beliefs that, there are differences among them. They're not all exactly alike, but when it comes to Russia, when it comes to China, when it comes to Venezuela and Cuba and countries like that, they all line up. As far as they're concerned, if the USA needs to intervene and attack these countries, it's necessary to do so. And they have this obsession with people like us and why we shouldn't be allowed to be part of the real socialist movement. I've said this again, but part of the reason that Breadtube is particularly dangerous is that they are trying to cultivate their audience not to be able to tell the difference between David Duke and Jimmy Dore. David Duke is a white supremacist, Ku Klux Klansman, anti-Semite hater, right? And Jimmy Dore is an amazing progressive comedian who advocates peace and justice in the world. You couldn't think of two individuals who are further apart. But yet in the Breadtube universe, Jimmy Dore is the same as David Duke because he has questioned aspects of the lockdowns, because he has questioned U.S. foreign policy in Syria. And they just constantly, you watch the streams of this vaush character constantly make this point: crypto fascist, crypto Nazi. I mean, it's this constant allegation. And it's a way to demonize somebody, and they are relentless. And they are really, I feel like the power structure is very afraid that in this time of economic crisis, working people will kind of do what happened during the Bernie movement. And they'll say, no, we're not going to let, the Democratic Party co-opt us. We are going to assert our own needs, and we are going to get up and demand things like healthcare and jobs. We're going to do things like force the vote. We're not going to be silenced. We're not going to let, people you pick for us, like AOC, be our leaders. We're going to actually make some real demands on the power structure. That's what the ruling elite is afraid of. So Breadtube is an attempt to prevent that from happening. That's my interpretation of it, at least.
Yeah, I also noticed they tend to be heavily against direct action too, because when we did the marches for Medicare for all, they heavily attacked us, smeared us, said things that weren't true, especially on Twitter. It's crazy on there.
For something that they're supposed to agree with, right? They come there for that. But go on. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no, right. Like, it doesn't make any sense. And then also, we did a general strike summit. Those same people heavily smeared, criticized us, attacked us. Any type of direct action that you try to do, that you try to lead, they tend to be against it, especially if it's not connected to an election or a campaign. That's the big thing. Like, they'll tell you that Joe Biden's doing a good job. They'll tell you, like, I've heard these talking points where they're like, yes, we need to intervene in China. And I'm like, well, no, if you're a socialist, like you say that you are, why would you be for intervention?
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's the amazing thing with the audience that they have. I mean, they are getting millions of views in some cases. YouTube, the algorithms just love them. I mean, it's just, it's like, with the audience they have, if these people were building some kind of real organization, if they were promoting the Medicare marches, if they were promoting, that things could really change. But it seems like they play the opposite role. If anyone starts to do something in real life other than vote for Joe Biden, they immediately attack it, accuse it of this, accuse it of that. They're really into the cancel culture, right? That's a big thing, right? That everyone's got a dossier on everyone. You can be sure, Sabby, that after tonight, or if not after the last time we spoke, somebody is going to take a screenshot of you talking to me and try to blame you for everything I've ever done that is controversial. And the same is going to happen to me. They're going to take a screenshot of this and try to blame me for everything that you've ever said that's controversial. Well, I'm sure there are things that I have said over the years that you don't agree with. And I'm sure there are things that you have said over the years that I don't agree with. But we're finding common ground here and trying to expose imperialism and capitalism. And that's how political progress has been made. But they engage in this cancel culture game where you're not allowed to do that, And I am firmly of the belief that I want to have, at least a friendship or some kind of relationship with everybody who is opposed to capitalism and imperialism. I've been to Iran. I've spoken at conferences in Iran. I've been to Russia. I've spoken at conferences in Russia. And obviously, I don't agree with all the people that were at those conferences. But at the end of the day, they are there because they're standing with Iran or standing with Russia against the imperialists. And that means that there's somebody who's more advanced than a lot of the folks in the United States are, a lot of the so-called left is. So I'm not ashamed to associate with them. For example, one of these bread tubers, a guy named Thought Slime is what he calls himself. He attacked me. He attacked me for the fact that I have a relationship with the Nation of Islam and that I defend Minister Louis Farrakhan. And he said, oh, how can you defend, all of that? Well, I brought up in response that, when Libya was being bombed and destroyed by the United States and NATO in 2011, the communist groups, the International Socialist Organization, the Communist Party, they didn't do anything about it. But the Nation of Islam, they convened the Millions March in Harlem, a huge demonstration against what was happening in Libya. Thousands and thousands of people in Harlem. Minister Louis Farrakhan spoke to it. And then they worked with, I used to work with former U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark. They worked with Ramsey Clark and with Cynthia McKinney, and they went to Libya to expose what was actually happening on the ground. So in my book, okay, fine. I don't agree with their religion. I'm not an adherent of the Nation of Islam. I'm not a Muslim. And I obviously, there's a lot of things that they say about gay marriage and stuff like that I don't agree with. But that said, I respect the Nation of Islam because they are standing against imperialism and they mobilized to stop a war, and they stood with the Libyan people and socialism in Libya against an imperialist onslaught. So at the end of the day, like, again, if you're going to stand against imperialism, you have to be willing to work with people. You have to have a relationship with people you might disagree with. And this gets to the essence, another important issue. You can't make social issues the cutting edge, right? I am for legalizing. I am for abortion being legal. I am against overturning Roe versus Wade. I am for gay marriage. I have no problem with gay marriage, But that said, there are a lot of people around the world that are socially conservative. I was just in Nicaragua, a socialist country. And it's a socialist country. They provide health care and jobs to their people. They've lifted people out of poverty, but they also have some very restrictive anti-abortion laws. Obviously, I don't agree with that, but that doesn't mean I can't recognize all the great things they've done for their people with socialism and jobs and education and healthcare and building a socialist economy in Nicaragua and lifting up the indigenous people and giving the indigenous people control over their own territories. And so much good has been done. We can recognize that, okay, they are a conservative Christian government. They feel that abortion and gay marriage are wrong. The slogan of the government is Christianity, socialism, and solidarity. That's what they have painted everywhere. And they just abortion, gay marriage. They don't do that. Well, I can disagree with them about that. And I also can recognize that that it's a little bit different in a country like Nicaragua than it is in the United States. And it's a little bit different for people of color than it is for white people, because in Nicaragua, they've dealt with, the white, colonizers coming in there and trying to breed out the population. There were times where they were, forcibly tying women's tubes. They were doing things to try and prevent them from having, children. So abortion has a different connotation. If you're a member of a group that has been actively, facing extermination, you can understand why there would be some suspicion about abortion. So again, I may not agree, but I can understand that. And again, Breadtube wants to make it all about social issues, and they want to put a label on everybody. If you don't agree with abortion, then you are a misogynist. If you don't agree with gay marriage, well, then you are a homophobe. And then if you talk to somebody, then that person who talked to you is homophobe adjacent. And then, and it just gets sillier and sillier when you get on with this. And basically what they're saying is you're not allowed to do what genuine anti-imperialist and anti-war voices and progressives have always done, which is build a united front, bring people together, find out what they have in common rather than what they disagree on, right? The internet is really good at emphasizing what people disagree on. I've lost so many friends over stupid Facebook arguments and stuff, but that's real politics, is about bringing people together to see their common interest.
Agreed. I want to shout out some of these super chats. Keo, thanks so much for the super chat. Maupin Noids unite. Thank you so much. So I think that is, thanks for the super chat. Breadtube hates America, but loves the U.S. government. Real Americans love our fellow people, but hate the U.S. government. Thank you so much for that. I'm a Phil American said Caleb should be a friend of any socialist movement. Thanks for having him on, Sabby, 100%. And thanks so much, Arshib Banapal. I hope I pronounced that correctly. There's no stopping the Maupin. Thank you so much for the super chat. You are well liked here, Caleb.
Well, thank you. Great. Yeah. Well, I do my streams very frequently. I'm streaming on YouTube, and I'm going to be on Rockfin pretty soon. And, we are constantly just doing the best we can to educate people about socialism. I've established a think tank called the Center for Political Innovation. You can check out our website, cpiusa.org. We have reading groups all across the country in different regions of the country. We have people, that are doing great, community volunteer work in Texas and in the DC area and in other places. And it's very exciting. A lot of people really like a message of, constructive, optimistic socialism, right? That socialism isn't about tearing things down. It's rather about building a whole new world based on working class power. And, our message is quite unique. We have our, as you're showing there on the screen, our 4-point plan to rescue the country. We have sent delegations to socialist countries like Nicaragua and elsewhere. And, on our website, we not only talk about issues that are affecting people around the world, we also talk about domestic issues like the Amazon fire and the conditions of workers there. And we talk about a lot of different things. We're trying to facilitate a conversation that can lead to moving the country away from greed and profits and the military industrial complex and prisons for profit and all the awful things that come from the capitalist system, and moving toward a society where the people and their needs come first.
Absolutely. I want to show you guys something in reference to how they'll respond to these talking points. So this was recent. This was on TYT, and they're criticizing Jimmy Dore about this whole Breadtube episode that he had with Max Blumenthal. So I want you guys to take a look at this. I'm only going to play a short part of it, but here we go.
Important enough to be monitored and controlled by the CIA. I'm not kidding. This was in response to a YouTube content creator by the name of Sean, who put together an excellent detailed video showing how Jimmy Dore spreads lies and conspiracy theories in regard to the coronavirus pandemic and the vaccine. In fact, most of his content these days is vaccine skepticism and garbage related to that. And Sean actually succeeded in showing how Jimmy Dore has these graphics that alter actual articles and what the articles are communicating. In fact, Jimmy Dore claimed that he had fired a producer for putting these misleading graphics together. And Max Blumenthal from the Gray Zone decided to join Jimmy Dore to talk about what was really behind Sean's actions. Let's watch.
Sean, who made a video about you, attacking you, who I actually didn't know he was affiliated with Breadtube, but he's considered part of their constellation. And the video attacking you, which relies heavily on official sources, the FDA says that, the World Health Organization says that. It looks a lot like this countering pseudoscience material, and it was very strategically placed. It was algorithmically boosted on YouTube.
Oh, it was definitely algorithmically boosted on YouTube. No doubt about that it was given the favored treatment on YouTube. The CIA and the intelligence beholden that Google and YouTube, they're in bed with the intelligence group. Of course they are. Google, Alphabet, the biggest and largest, most profitable communications company in the history of the world. Any company, of course they are. Go ahead. I'm sorry, I interrupt you. But yes, that was what, as soon as I read the story, I'm like, oh, that's they funded this. That hit job on me because it was super professionally done. It looked like it had to have some resources behind it.
All right, Grandpa, let's move it along.
Okay, so a whole bunch of hilarious things come out of that. First of all, yeah, they're working around the clock on algorithmically boosting rando Sean's videos, no offense to Sean, right?
Yeah.
Against Jimmy Dore, because at the CIA headquarters at Langley, they're like, what's going on the Dore case? Have we boosted all the algorithms yet? Okay. I mean, these are just clowning around, but now it's hilarious now. I mean, before they were, implying that Amy Goodman's CIA, now Sean is CIA.
No, everyone's CIA. Everyone's CIA.
Everyone except Jimmy Dore. But wait a minute. If the CIA controls Alphabet and Google and YouTube, earlier, Jimmy was claiming that his show is so much bigger than ours. Dun, dun, dun! Was the CIA algorithmically boosting Jimmy? If that was true, and he's so large and we're so small, is the CIA on his side?
So you guys see what they'll do. Like Caleb said, they'll laugh about it. They'll laugh it off. It's really interesting to me because TYT, they're on the corporate algorithm. They have millions of subscribers. I'm not even subscribed to TYT and they show up on my homepage. Yep. I'm just, why are you here? I'm not even subscribed to you. So the fact that they say, well, Jimmy has large numbers, etc., they have millions of subscribers. Jimmy Dore does not have millions of subscribers. So you see how they try to deflect and put it back on him.
Yeah, and I mean, that video was basically a confession because notice that at no point, if you go and watch that interview, and if you even watch the clip they showed, at no point did they say that video by Sean, they had evidence that it was actually funded by the CIA. It was just, they were saying it was algorithmically boosted. And they were referring to the fact that they do have evidence that what Abigail Thorne was paid to do by British intelligence was to, promote around the same kind of issue, around quote unquote COVID disinformation, to go after critics of the lockdowns, etc. So they had proof of that. They didn't show you that in the clip, but they had actual proof about what went on in Britain with Abigail Thorne. They also put words in their mouth and claimed they were saying that every critic of them is CIA or something. And then at one point, it's just like naivete, right? When Shank Uger is on there and he's saying, the CIA, yeah, that's what they do, is they control algorithms and stuff. Actually, handling, public information is probably one of the main things that intelligence agencies do. If you look up the history of Project Mockingbird, that was revealed during the 1960s, and how the CIA, there were cases where like the CIA would have journalists and they would write the articles for them and then just give it to them and say, put your byline on it. You know, there were other cases where, I mean, the CIA handling the media and handling journalists and whispering in their ears, telling them what to say is like one of the main things the intelligence agencies do in the United States. That is like, that's not disputed by anybody. And then you talk about the Congress for Cultural Freedom program that I referenced earlier. You talk about Project MK Ultra. That's an interesting CIA project that's been revealed. The fact the CIA had a program to promote the use of drugs, hallucinogenic drugs, all throughout the United States, right? That's public information. They were going around encouraging college students and others to use drugs and distributing LSD throughout the country. The idea that they might possibly promote some YouTube videos over others is not outrageous at all. There is nothing remotely outrageous about it, right? It fits exactly what they've always done. But, you know, if you've watched a little too much James Bond and you think the CIA are like running around, you know, rescuing women and blowing up buildings, okay, you might like laugh at that. But in the actual intelligent world, the actual intelligence world is the you know, is the world of covertly kind of nudging debate to go in a certain direction.
Yes, agreed. Make sure I shout this out as well. Bigfoot said, all Bigfoots love Caleb. May the forest be with it. Thanks so much for the super chat.
All right.
Hollywood, thanks so much. Borger Kang.
Whatever. Next question.
And Ashura, who would you want defending Tout Slime or Jimmy Dore? Thank you so much for the super chat. Desert Mantis asked this question. Huh?
I don't even know what that last one means. I mean, this is some inside baseball, you know. That's an expression. You ever hear about inside baseball? I used to have a grandfather, and he was a really big baseball fan, right? And if you got him in a room with another baseball fan, suddenly he would start talking, and they'd be talking about like rules and obscure aspects of the game and players and all kinds of stuff you'd never heard of. And someone told me that's called inside baseball. And that, unfortunately, that's one of the side results of the internet culture, is that pretty soon there's all these memes and code words that mean all kinds of things. I mean, you know, and like that probably means a lot to somebody somewhere, but I don't even know what that last one meant, you know. And so that's kind of that. And that's one thing I've struggled to do. That's part of what I struggled to do with this book, is that a lot of, you know, material about Marxism and socialism is written in a kind of inside baseball way. Right? It's written assuming that you know all these details about things. I was told that the way that a socialist should talk, you should assume, especially if you're a socialist in the United States, that your audience knows nothing, because people in the United States don't know anything about Marxism and socialism. You should start at the beginning, start with the basics, right? And help people to understand the concepts in kind of a patient way. And that's the tradition that I come from. That's the tradition of William Z. Foster. That's the tradition of Sam Marcy, and that, you know, explaining things in a popular way. And I think that part of the problem with the internet is that, you know, it gets you in your little specific corner of the internet and the little specific debates that you're having in your little specific universe. And then as a result, you know, when you talk to somebody who's not in part of your little tiny corner of the blogospheres or whatever, you know, when you try to talk to them about politics, it's almost like you're speaking another language. I work very hard to not be that way. I want to be able to talk to anybody, you know, whether they're a Trump supporter, whether they're somebody who's not into politics at all. I want to be able to have a conversation with them about why capitalism is the problem and we need to move towards socialism. And I think that's something that all of us in this world need to challenge ourselves to do. You know, if I meet somebody who's never heard of Jimmy Dore, never heard of Breadtube, never heard of the Young Turks, I should be able to explain to them why Medicare for all is better. You know, and that's something I think we should all challenge ourselves to do. That's my opinion.
Agreed. Desert Mantis said, are Breadtube neoliberals?
Well, neoliberalism refers to an economic school of thought that is associated with Milton Friedman, Friedrich von Hayek, the Montpellier Society. It's the belief that the government should, you know, keep its hands off the economy, basically. It's, you know, privatizations. What's interesting is that, you know, in some ways there is a little bit of overlap, because one of the brilliant, you know, quote unquote talking points of vaush is he will get on there and say things like socialism has nothing to do with the government. Actually, it has a lot to do with the government, actually. But they, you know, as far as they're concerned, socialism just means voluntary worker cooperatives. It means you and your friends start a cooperative business and share the profits. Instead of a wage, you all are like co-owners of the company. And that's their idea of what socialism is. And it's a way to not make demands on the government. You're not demanding like a socialist working class government. You're not demanding things like healthcare and Medicare for all and education for free and such. You're just saying, oh, we want to experiment with this new form of a business that's a worker cooperative. And that is a form of quote unquote socialism that would be in line with neoliberalism. Milton Friedman would not object to that. And that's actually when you see debates between Ben Shapiro and some of these Breadtube fans or whatever, they'll get up and they'll say, well, socialism just means I start a worker cooperative. And Ben Shapiro, who is an advocate of free market neoliberal economics, will say to them, I'm not against that. You want to go start a business, you can run it however you want. And that's the thing. Like what they claim socialism is, I think Vaush said on one of his streams, socialism means everything would be exactly the same, except all the companies would be worker cooperatives. I don't think that that's out of line with neoliberalism. And the thing is, I mean, okay, let's imagine that the military industrial complex was a worker cooperative, right? That Boeing, all the workers, they didn't get a paycheck from Boeing. They just got a share of the profits. Well, that would mean that next time it was time to have a war, all the workers at Boeing would be very excited about it because they would want their profits to go up, right? Imagine the prison industrial complex, private prisons that they were run as a worker cooperative. So all the guards, instead of getting a paycheck, they just got a share of the profits that this private prison corporation made. Would that make things better? Think about big pharma, right? I mean, as long as profit is still the motivating force for the economy, as long as profit is still in command of the economy, that's still capitalism. Cooperatives are better. I'm not opposed to cooperatives by any means, but they don't get rid of the problem of profits in command. And that is the fundamental problem with capitalism, is that profit, not the needs of society, comes first. And that is the problem. That is the problem with capitalism. And worker cooperatives are not the alternative to capitalism. They are something that can exist within capitalism. And a lot of capitalist corporations have profit sharing mechanisms. For example, a lot of companies, a lot of bigger companies, the retirement pension plans are profit sharing, meaning that your pension is based on how well the company's stock is doing. That's not socialism, that's capitalism. And that socialism is when the banks and the factories, the major centers of economic power are controlled by society. It's when the means of production are operated to serve public good and not profits. It's a government of action that fights for working families. That's what socialism is. And Breadtube, in a way, they kind of obscure that. And by doing so, they're not challenging neoliberalism. Neoliberalism says profits must run our economy. And socialism is supposed to be the alternative to that. So in a way, they serve neoliberalism.
I'm a Phil American. Thank you so much for the super chat. Thanks for your educational videos, Caleb. You spoke to me the way my uber woke socialist friends couldn't. If it wasn't for you, I probably wouldn't have ever learned about Marxism myself. You are a god.
Well, thank you very much. There's only one God, and he's not me, but I do appreciate that. And and I do my best, right? And we should all struggle to try and be more popular. I love, if you go back to the history of the Communist Party, of the Socialist Party, Eugene Debs, William Z. Foster, Gus Hall, Huey Newton of the Black Panther Party. They have some pamphlets you can get on like archive.org and read, and they are amazing. I mean, they just lay out our beliefs in very clear, coherent ways. Not if you go to Barnes and Noble and you go to the section on politics and socialism, you're going to find something written by some academic professor that's going to be very hard to get through. But that's not how these people operated. Debs and Gus Hall and the Black Panthers, they were speaking to broad audiences, and they learned to be very concise in the way they explain things. They learned to be very popular, to use popular examples, and their rhetoric was far superior. They were populists. And that's the thing. Populism, they've made populism into a bad word. Like, all populism is like Donald Trump. All populism is racism. No, populism just means you're mobilizing the masses of people. And socialism was the original populism, right? It's mobilizing the broad masses of people, we, the working people, against the billionaires, those who control the banks, factories, and industries. So socialism is very populist. And in fact, right-wing populism, came long after socialism did. You didn't have right-wing populism until the 1930s. You didn't have right-wing populism. But going back to the 1700s with the Chartist movement in Britain and the Diggers, or the True Levelers in England, or the French Revolution and Henry Saint Simon. Left-wing populism was the original populism. And the idea that to be left-wing means we should oppose populism is just incorrect. It's a delusion. We're the real populists. Donald Trump is a fake populist. You know, he claimed he was fighting for the working people, but then he lowered taxes on the rich. He attacked Iran and almost got us into World War III. He lifted all the regulations on the drilling and hurt the environment. Donald Trump wasn't really a populist. His rhetoric sounded populist, but he wasn't really fighting for the people. But if you look at the history of the United States, figures like Huey Long, for example, Huey Long did fight for the people, right? And that's why he was shot down on the Capitol steps in Louisiana. Who else? I mean, you can talk about, even when Abraham Lincoln was first getting elected, right? He was seen as a man of the people from Illinois, and he came into office. He gave speeches condemning the greed of the capitalists. You can look this up. Abraham Lincoln gave a speech, and he said the capitalists have generally worked together to fleece the people. That's a speech and he said that labor comes before capital, and labor is superior to capital. It's Abraham Lincoln who said that, right? And Abraham Lincoln had a communist general in his army. August Willich was a member of the Communist International. August Willich became a brigadier general in his army. And Karl Marx wrote, an endorsement of Abraham Lincoln, and wrote for the New York City Tribune, which was the main Republican newspaper of New York City at that time. Abraham Lincoln was a radical. Abraham Lincoln was a populist when he came into office. He was seen as kind of leading an upsurge of the small farmers and the abolitionists and others who were tired of the Southern slave owners. And the overturning of slavery in the United States, and what W.E.B. Du Bois writes about in Black Reconstruction, his brilliant history of the Civil War, that really was a moment where we saw a populist struggle against the plantation owners that were tied in with the British Empire. Right? It was the British who wanted to keep slavery going on because they wanted cheap cotton for their textile mills. But Abraham Lincoln and the labor movement and the abolitionists and Frederick Douglass and so many of these great voices came together and they defeated the slaveholders. And it was a victory for the United States. It was the United States saying we're not going to be part of this global free trade system. Adam Smith economics. You want to talk about neoliberalism? Well, Adam Smith, the economic inspirer of the British global free trade system, that is something that the United States was formed in opposition to. Alexander Hamilton, he strongly believed that we should have a state-run bank, a national bank that built things like lighthouses and schools, et cetera. And Alexander Hamilton and his economic theories were vehemently opposed to what we now call neoliberalism, which is that British Empire free trade system. And that was the origin of the United States. And that is one thing the Breadtubers don't want to talk about, right? They don't want to talk about the fact that throughout US history, there has been a fight between different schools of economic thought, and that free trade, privatizations, and all of these things, that's not the whole history of the United States. We've had plenty of people who believe in that and have done awful things, but there's a whole other side to US history that they don't want to get into. And that's one thing I get attacked for, is I'm an advocate of, I say that when socialism does come here, it will be an American socialism. It'll be a socialism unique to the United States, and it'll be rooted in our progressive traditions, the labor movement, the struggle against racism, the struggle for the rights of women, the anti-war protests that have gone on. There is a progressive side to America, and that I am not going to let the right wing claim America all for themselves, right? That there's a whole other side to this country, and that I'm not going to surrender what it means to be an American to the right wing and to capitalism and imperialism. I'm going to say that the progressive forces in the history of this country have just as much right to the history of this country as the reactionaries do. And that when socialism comes to America, it's not like we're not going to get invaded by Russia. We're not going to get invaded by Venezuela or Vietnam. What's going to happen is it'll be that tradition of progressive popular struggles against war and injustice. It'll be that tradition taking power. That is what socialism will be. It'll be the good side of America taking power in Washington, D.C. And that's how we need to understand it. When I talk about, in China, they call their system socialism with Chinese characteristics. The only type of socialism we're ever going to have here in America will be a socialism with American characteristics. It'll be a unique socialism coming from our own history of progressive struggles. And if we're serious, it's important to study other countries. I'm all about learning about the world. but we need to be digging into the revolutionary history of this country, figuring out what we can learn from people like the Black Panthers, people like Eugene Debs, people like Frederick Douglass. I mean, we need to dig into the history of this country, because that is ultimately going to be what leads to socialism here.
Yeah, and one of the things I noticed too, like growing up, when it came to the school system, when they taught us about those people, it was in a negative way. Like when they taught us about the Black Panthers, they told us they were a militant group. They didn't tell us the Black Panthers were feeding people, were clothing people, were building their own clinics to help people in their community. That was totally left out, was not in the history books, because they don't want you to know. They want you to see this as a bad thing. When they talked about Martin Luther King, they did so in a positive way. When they talked about Malcolm X, same thing. They said he was radical, he was militant. So you have to ask yourself, why do they deliver those talking points when we talk about people who are revolutionaries in this country?
Oh, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And they cover up the final years of Dr. Martin Luther King's life when he condemned capitalism and he said that the country needs socialism. They cover that up too, and I didn't learn about that until I was in college and I started reading, the last book Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. ever wrote, Where Do We Go From Here, calls for a guaranteed minimum income and a jobs guarantee, right? And he has a national holiday. And I tell, these PragerU, these right-wing YouTube channels, all the nasty, hateful things they say about socialists. Socialists are un-American, socialists are traitors, socialists are idiots. They're saying that about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. because he was a socialist. He openly said he wanted a democratic form of socialism for the United States. He wasn't a communist. He was not an advocate of Marxism, but he was definitely not a capitalist, definitely a socialist. So yeah, that gets covered up as well, right? That Dr. Martin Luther King had his revolutionary side as well. And so, they do a lot to cover these things up. Absolutely. No, when I was a kid, they would tell us in school, I went to a school that was almost entirely white, and we were told over and over again that the Black Panthers were the black version of the Ku Klux Klan. That's nothing further from the truth. In fact, there were a lot of white supporters and white allies of the Black Panthers, but that was drummed into our heads. Well, there was this group called the Black Panthers that went around murdering white people. Malarkey. False. That's not what happened, but that's what we were told. So I had to go do my own reading. And it was, when I started investigating communists and what they had to say, I realized that a lot of communists in the 1960s had worked with the Black Panthers. And then I started reading that the Black Panthers themselves had been advocates of Marxism and that they had gone to North Korea and gone to China and they promoted and sold Mao Zedong's Little Red Book. And that's one of the wild things is these breadtubers all like to talk about the Black Panthers. They like to play up the Black Panthers. It's trendy now. There's documentaries, PBS, but then on the one hand, they'll be like, oh, we love the Black Panthers. But then they'll say, but anyone who supports North Korea is a crypto Nazi. And it's like, well, the Black Panthers supported North Korea. The Black Panthers supported Mao in China. The Black Panthers supported the Soviet Union. The Black Panthers got money from Gaddafi, right? Gaddafi's supporters, they used to come to the Black Panther offices. There would be a knock on the door, is the story I heard. There'd be a knock on the door at the Black Panther office in Chicago. They would open the door, and there'd be a Libyan diplomat there with a suitcase, and he'd say, thank you, and he'd just hand them a suitcase. They'd open it up, and it'd be, all kinds of money in there. That's what a socialist country called Libya did to support the Black freedom struggle. And so to kind of obscure that, that kind of shows that if the Black Panthers were around today, these people would want them put in prison. These people would call them traitors. They call them tankies and red browns and Nazbols, right? That Fred Hampton and Huey Newton and the Black Panthers were very much a revolutionary Marxist group that was aligned with global struggles against imperialism. They saw the struggles of people in the United States for national liberation as intrinsically tied up with the struggles of people around the world against imperialism. And that's the correct approach. That is the Marxist approach.
I agree. Why do you think like some of these breadtubers, because some of them were Bernie supporters, why do you think they were fine with Bernie Sanders saying, let's fight for these things, let's all come together? Because Bernie Sanders said the 99% of us, we need to come together and fight against the top 1%. Why do you think they were fine with Bernie Sanders saying that, but they're not okay with those of us who are not running for election? Why are they not okay with us saying those things now?
Well, here's the thing. My whole life, there's always been like a far left Democrat. Dennis Kucinich was often this, right? And Dennis Kucinich, everybody knew he wasn't going to win, but he would talk more of a far left line and he wouldn't win. But then he would tell all of his supporters, okay, we did our best. Now vote for Bill Clinton. Now vote for John Kerry. if that was all that Bernie Sanders was, if Bernie Sanders had just been a normal far left Democrat who gets everyone excited and then says, okay, go and vote for Biden, go and vote for Hillary, these folks would be fine with it. But what changed in 2016? 2016 was a big moment because it was the first time in my life where, first of all, it was clearly rigged against Bernie Sanders in 2016. That's the first thing. And second of all, even after Bernie Sanders said, okay, go and vote for Hillary, a bunch of his supporters, I was at the convention in Philadelphia, didn't go along with it. And they said, we're not going to take this. And they made a scene in the convention. They booed, they protested. I mean, it was big. And that had never happened before. And that's what these breadtubers are afraid of. They want Bernie Sanders to just be like Dennis Kucinich used to be, just, the far left guy who doesn't have a chance, but gets people that might be going somewhere else back into the Democratic Party. They're fine with him playing that role. But because the Bernie movement turned into something else and it took on a life of its own, that's what they're afraid of. And that's why they want to crush what's left of it. They want to crush the Medicare for All movement, etc.
Thank you so much, Reese, for the super chat. Jesus was a socialist.
Absolutely. That's the name of a book that we recently published at the Center for Political Innovation. We published it. It's called Jesus is a Socialist, is what we titled it. Keaton Mansfield is the other co-editor of it. And it's mainly verses from the Bible that talk about how the last shall be first and the first shall be last, and talk about social justice, as well as quotes from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., as well as a speech by Eugene Debs that he gave about Jesus called Jesus the Supreme Leader. It's quite a compilation that we put together. It's a very small book, and look, I am a Christian, right? And it took me a long time. I grew up in a church. That's the way I grew up. But as I started getting interested in communism as a teenager, a lot of communists are atheists. And so I moved toward atheism. But then, I went to Iran, and I went to the Islamic Republic of Iran, and I went on a ship to Yemen. I went on a humanitarian mission to Yemen to deliver aid to the people of Yemen. And our ship created an international incident. The Israelis and the Saudis accused our ship of smuggling weapons, which we were not doing. And then the day we were supposed to arrive in Yemen, they bombed the port of Hodeidah 8 times in a single day. And dock workers were killed. They bombed the medical university at Hodeidah. And during that whole trip, and we had, at that point with the bombing, we had to turn our ship around and go to Djibouti. But at that point, on that ship, as we saw like U.S. warplanes like nosediving over us, and we saw the reports alleging we were smuggling weapons, which we were not, and I feared for my life. And I was on a ship with Iranians, and these Iranians, some of them spoke English, and Iran is a very religious country. So we talked a lot about the Bible, and we talked a lot about God and what it all meant. And I realized on that boat that I would never have been on that boat if it hadn't been for the teachings of Jesus, if it hadn't been for my Christian upbringing. In fact, I never would have thought about becoming a communist if it wasn't for my religious upbringing. And then I came to discover that throughout Latin America, in Venezuela, Hugo Chavez and Maduro, they are both Christians. Nicaragua is a Christian socialist country. And Bolivia, Evo Morales, was a Christian. He even met with the Pope and gave the Pope a crucifix with a hammer and sickle on it to make the point. And that I don't think there is any contradiction between being a Christian and being a communist. And in fact, in Russia, the Communist Party of Russia, which is the second largest political party in the country, gets millions of votes in the elections. The leader of it is a Christian. He's a Russian Orthodox Christian. And so based on that, I rediscovered my faith. And when I rediscovered my faith, many people were shocked by it. They said, oh, how can you do this? But at the end of the day, if there is no right and wrong, right? If there is no higher power, if there's no point in life, if we're all just a cluster of atoms, that just happen to be here, why fight for justice? Why fight for things like Medicare for all? And I believe there is a higher purpose, and my faith at this point is very important to me. That said, my organization, the Center for Political Innovation, it takes no religious position. There are, I'd say, about 50% atheists, but then there are Christians like myself, there are Muslims, there are Jews, there are people of all religious faiths, and I am for a secular movement, right? I think there should be no religious test of any political movement, right? That when we're in this country, we have a separation of church and state. So obviously we don't want a religious political party or a religious government. But my faith is very important to me. And it continues to be very much so. And I think that we need to get over, first of all, there's a lot of propaganda convincing people that somehow to be a good Christian, you have to believe in capitalism. And that has to be challenged because, because the teachings of Jesus are not supporting the billionaires and the rich people. It's supporting the downtrodden. It says, Jesus said that it's easier for a camel to get through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to go to heaven. And that there are many places where Jesus is very clearly talking about, the struggles of ordinary people against the rich and powerful. We need to counter that. And then on top of that, we need to counter this trend in the socialist movement of thinking that if you're religious, that you're an idiot. If you're religious, you must be a right-wing, bigoted person. You must be hating gay people or hating women or something. We need to counter that as well. There needs to be more respect for Christians among the socialist movement, and there needs to be more respect for socialism among Christians. Because at the end of the day, I think the two beliefs, the Christian religion and socialist politics, I think they can very easily overlap. They are, in a lot of the world, they overlap very well. In Russia, they overlap. In Latin America, they overlap. There's no reason they shouldn't overlap here in the United States.
Well said. I have to say something about the church thing in reference to money too, because something that I've noticed is that sometimes I would see people, this is when I was growing up, and I grew up in the church, and there would be people sometimes that would give their last, like they didn't really have it money wise, but they would still give their last when, the bowl would come around to give tithes and things like that. And I'm looking around and I asked this question when I was in high school, why does the preacher have a huge house and a nice car? And I'm watching the congregation, some people who really just did not have the money to give away, to feel like they had to do it. They had to do it because they were told so by the preacher, but the preacher's living large, living really well, and you're still struggling. So that was one of the things when you talk about the money with the church, that was something that was often brought up. And like when I was in high school, it was like we were felt, they made us feel ashamed. We didn't give money. So it just, that was something I remember. Thank you so much for Miss Defund the Empire super chat. What critiques do you have of Richard Wolff's advocacy for worker co-ops?
Well, I love Richard Wolff. It's really, every interaction I've ever had with him has been an amazing interaction. He is one of the most well-respected Marxist intellectuals in the United States. His depth of knowledge is vast. It's actually Richard Wolff who suggested, I had never read Karl Marx's very important book, The Theories of Surplus Value. I had read Capital. I had read, I'd read The Poverty of Philosophy. I'd read the Communist Manifesto and other texts, but it was Richard Wolff who suggested, he said, if you really want to understand economics, you want to understand Marx's critique of Adam Smith, and you want to understand Malthusianism, which is a really big trend, this idea that there's too many people in the world, right? You really ought to read Theories of Surplus Value. And it was because of Richard Wolff I went and studied theories of surplus value. So I love Richard Wolff. He's a great guy. And worker cooperatives, again, it's better if no one's exploiting anybody else. It's still capitalism, though. The solution is a government of action that fights for working families. But the other thing that Richard Wolff has, he made a video in response to a video I made one time. And it's one thing that he's often emphasized is there are different interpretations of these ideas. There are different interpretations of Marxism. And that's one thing, this idea that like it's my way or the highway. No, Marxism is one of the most important ideologies in all of human history. The whole 20th century was defined by Marxism. There would be no labor movement if it wasn't for Marxism. The struggle for women's rights around the world and women's suffrage, was largely because of Marxism. It's because of Marxism that China is now the second largest economy in the world. Before the Marxists came to power, China was a deeply poor country. It's because of Marxism we have space travel. It was the Soviet Union and Marxists that invented space travel. So this is a hugely important ideology in the history of the human race. The impact that Marx has had on human history is astoundingly big. So the idea that there might be different interpretations of these ideas shouldn't really be surprising to anybody. Yet a lot of people, they get their understanding of Marxism and they walk around like that's the only way to understand it. Well, no. I'm very critical of Trotskyism, for example. I don't like Leon Trotsky. I think he was dead wrong about a lot of things, but I understand that it's a different interpretation. Social democracy, anarchism, these are different interpretations of the Marxist worldview, and that's okay.
I forgot to ask you this last time you were on, Caleb, so I'm glad someone reminded me of this. Ask about MMT. How do you feel about modern monetary theory?
Honestly, I have questions about it. I am not surprised that some of the things that they point out are very, very accurate. This notion that the government is always just, where's the money? We just don't have the money, and yet it prints money all the time. That's a fair point. However, I have questions about the long-term implications of it, right? It might be a very good short-term solution, but I have questions about it, honestly. I just don't know enough about it to give a really fair critique. But on the surface, as an immediate solution, if we were to start, printing money and giving money to sections of the economy that need it, like infrastructure, rather than just giving it to banks like we do now, that would be a good step forward. I wouldn't be opposed to it. So on the surface level, I'm in agreement with their immediate program. I just have questions about how long-term of a solution that is.
Okay. Thanks for the super chat, Ashura. They also say being a Christian is invading others. Thank you so much for that. And thanks, Horny Unicorn, for the super chat. Wallerstein ?
I don't know
Thanks
what that
so
is.
much.
Again,
I'm not sure either.
yeah, Wallerstein. I don't know what that means, but yeah, I mean, the idea that that Christian means invading others, right? I mean, that is, I mean, Jesus himself was standing against the Roman Empire, right? And he was organizing a people that were colonized and oppressed by the Roman occupiers. One thing that I also think is interesting is that it's interesting because you talk about being in the church and the hypocrisy. Joel Osteen, right? I mean, what that man is preaching is not Christianity. It is a self-help sermon. It's, go out and work hard. It has nothing to do. It's this prosperity gospel. It's not Christianity. And yeah, he lives in splendor. And yeah, I mean, he's doing pretty well. I mean, even a lot of what we hear from the right, they're always emphasizing like family values, right? Family values. When we were kids, it was always, obey your parents and, follow authority because that's the Bible. Well, I think people should go and read, Matthew chapter 10, where Jesus Christ says to his followers, I come not to bring peace to the earth, but a sword. For I come to turn a man against his father and a daughter against her mother. And a man's enemies shall be those of his own household. I mean, Jesus was telling people to leave their family, leave what they had, go out and take great risks and sacrifice for the cause of justice. He wasn't saying to just blindly follow authority. That was clearly not his message. He was preaching a message of social upheaval. You read about him driving the money changers out of the temple. So yeah, what the modern religious right preaches, this is not Christianity, and it's largely, I would argue, it's a synthetic creation. It emerged in the 1970s. In about 1969, 1970, there was a crisis in the right wing because young people were all hippies and they were protesting the wars and such, and they weren't particularly into religion. The church didn't have much influence over younger people. But there was one like weird variant of hippies they called Jesus freaks, or the Jesus people. And they were people that were hippies that, they fit being a hippie in with being a Christian. And so Billy Graham, who was a right-winger, was the spiritual advisor of Richard Nixon, started featuring the Jesus freaks on his broadcasts. And it was a way to try and reinvent Christianity for the baby boomer generation. And then what's even more interesting is then Richard Nixon imported a couple years later into the United States the Reverend Sun Myung Moon, who is a Korean pastor and is leader of the Unification Church, which is a crazy right-wing anti-communist cult from South Korea. And the Moonies started infiltrating like hippie spaces, pretending to be leftists and hippies, but at the same time recruiting people to this extremist anti-communist group. And by about 1978, that's when Jerry Falwell comes forward and starts the Moral Majority. And what really happened was what you can call the modern evangelical Christian right. It was a reinvention of Christianity for the Cold War years, for the late Cold War and for baby boomers, right? It was an update, and it was, the Christian rock and roll music, a lot of the emotional appeal. This was all a shift, and it was very much created to serve the neocons, the Bush faction of the U.S. government. The neoconservatives, they needed a base of supporters. So the modern Christian right really emerged then. We've always had fanatically religious people in the United States, sure, but what you can call the Christian right, the Mike Pence people, that's a very new development that didn't really solidify until the late 70s. But the very beginnings of it were happening in 1969, 1970 with Billy Graham, and then later with the Moonies and the Unification Church. It's kind of an interesting development in U.S. politics, I think.
Agreed. I'm ready for those chats, Eric, from Roger, when you're ready, from Rockfin. So I can go ahead and go into those.
All right.
Thank you so much for the super chat, Delthea Simmons. Prosperity gospel is a propertied gospel. Oh, thanks so much for the super chat.
Yeah.
All right, here we go. Thanks so much, Roger Meadows, for the tips on Rockfin. It was an honor to meet your acquaintance, sir. Sorry again for nearly scaring the living daylights out of you. My bad. You can tell the story from your perspective if you like. I don't mind as long as you download Co-op Ride. The ride was too short anyway, and I could see that if it were longer, we would have chopped it up a good bit about a whole host of things, but glad to meet you in person anyway. As long as we pay these people no mind and take the notorious BIG's advice, stay low and keep firing and continue to do what we do. Caleb, what you did by luring them out reminds me of KRS-One lyric when he said, I set the warm milk in the glass and watched the snakes come out of the grass. Good job. Stanley Levinson, who was associated with MLK, was a communist, and JFK, who liked him, asked to distance himself. I will tell you, like I told Shahid when Sab had him on, government using the CIA is the hitman corp America and Wall Street give are the and Wall Street give are the ones giving the orders, and SCOTUS projects them. Replace core with cooperatives and charter a network of public postal banks throughout the US to ensure community banks and credit unions have them do a hostile takeover of the Fed to serve the public interest. This makes the CIA inert. There will be no left for SCOTUS to protect except us. Support the New York Public Bank Act. That would allow municipalities to start their own public bank, and the Budget Equity Amendment Act, which grants the legislature to have an equal role with the governor in the budgeting process. We're the only state in the country where the power of the purse is given to the executive branch. This amendment will put lawmakers in better negotiating position to allow state lawmakers to bring more resources and money home to their Senate and Assembly districts rather than be at the whim of whatever the governor wants. How else do you think Cuomo was able to cut $3.5 billion in state Medicaid funding while rejecting $7 billion in Medicare funding from Trump administration? Article 1, Section 8, Clause 5 gives Congress the coinage power to mint a platinum coin and assign it whatever value they want and appropriate it towards whatever target they want. MMT is not needed. Not to mention, if public banks took over the Fed, also it would be a form of MMT. James Baldwin was co-opted. Wow. Remember when Clinton drew a wedge between Conway Torrey and Jesse Jackson? Well said, Roger Meadows.
Yeah.
Well said.
Yeah, that was a neat experience. I got in an Uber, and the Uber driver was Roger, and he was just, wow. I jumped. I didn't know. I got into the car, and he's like, "Are you Caleb Maupin?" I'm like, yes, I am. It was a little startling, but then after that, I realized he was friendly. He was a fan of your show, and we had a great chat. I guess he's started he's worked with some others. They've started a drivers co-op in New York City, which is very exciting because I know Uber really mistreats its employees in many cases. A lot of these cab companies, are not so good. So I didn't know about this drivers co-op. So that's very exciting, and it shows that we are everywhere. We might think that, oh, we're not as big as some of these breadtubers, but people that are part of this genuine anti-imperialist progressive left that is standing up to the power structure, we are everywhere. You'll find us everywhere. So very exciting times. It was really great to meet Roger for sure, and it was quite an exciting thing, especially since I was going to be on with you the next night. So there you go.
I know. I told him, I was like, "What in the world?" I was like, "Caleb met you before I met you," so it was pretty interesting. Yes, it's called Co-op Ride in New York. Thank you so much. Defund the Empire. Wolf defends capitalism by the employer and employee. Defines capitalism by the employer and employee relationship. How do you define capitalism? Good question.
Sure. Well, I take my definition from Frederick Engels, who said that capitalism is, I guess the full quote from Frederick Engels is, under capitalism, the means of production only function as preliminary transformation into capital. And Mao, the leader of the Communist Revolution in China, put it much more simply. He said, capitalism is a system of profits in command. Under capitalism, production and the economy functions in order to make profits. Whereas under socialism, society controls the means of production. That's when you have an economy that is organized to serve public good. And so that's why China, despite having a lot of corporations and a lot of billionaires, et cetera, it's still a socialist country, because at the end of the day, the state controls the economy. The Chinese government has a 5-year economic plan. The Chinese government owns the banks and controls the banks. They control the major industries, the state-run industries, and they plan out the economy. And the same for Cuba, and the same for Venezuela and Nicaragua and Bolivia and countries like that, that they have a socialist economy because it's no longer profits in command. It's society overall in command. And that is what you could call the Marxist-Leninist, I think, definition of socialism, I guess, or the 21st century socialist definition of socialism. And I would argue that, there are different forms of socialism. Bolivarian socialism in Latin America is very different than what the Soviet Union was. Baath socialism in the Middle East that you saw in Iraq with Saddam Hussein, or you saw in Syria with, the Syrian government, that's Baathist Arab socialism. In Libya, they had Islamic socialism under the leadership of Gaddafi. There are different forms of socialism in the world today. Vietnam, they have what they call the socialist-oriented market economy of Vietnam. There are different forms of socialism in the world today. It doesn't all match up exactly, but in all of them, what they do have in common is that profits are not in command. Society as a whole, you have a mass movement that has kind of created a new government, and that new government then controls the economy for the people. I tell people one great way to understand socialism is that, one thing that we all know here in the United States is the corporations control the government. That's capitalism. Socialism is when the government controls the corporations. That's socialism. When we take control of our government and then use a popular government of action to control the corporations and make the economy work for us with profits no longer in command, that's socialism.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Andrew, for the super chat. I got a tour of the Mooney Church one time. Wild. Oh boy.
Yeah, well, they're very influential. I mean, the Washington Times is their publication. They were part of Donald Trump's Capitol riot on January 6th. The Unification Church bust in their members. And that's one thing I must say, that Capitol riot, and I got into it a little bit with ContraPoints on Twitter earlier today. That Capitol riot was awful. I don't condone that kind of behavior. Obviously, that's illegal activity. People can't engage like that. But, that crowd, yes, it had that racist Confederate flag was all over that crowd. That's true. But you know what else was all over that flag? Another racist flag, the Israeli flag. And no one talks about that. There are Israeli flags all over that crowd. And you know what else was there? The flag of the Shah of Iran, the Pahlavi monarchy, that lion with a sword underneath him, the symbol of the people who want to overthrow the Islamic Republic of Iran and bring back the Shahs of Sunset Park. They showed up and they had their flags, and Miami Cubans who want to overthrow Castro. They bust in by the thousands from Miami for that rally. And in addition to that, the Falun Gong, which is a religious cult that is trying to overthrow the Chinese government that runs the Epoch Times, they had a huge contingent at that rally as well. And nobody talks about that. Nobody talks about that. They make it sound like it's just, average, poor, working class Americans from red states. They went there and they were awful and they're awful. Well, there were a lot of foreign interest groups there. And part of what Donald Trump did is he kind of attached himself to, entities from various countries, the folks who want to overthrow the Cuban government, the folks who want to overthrow the Iranian government, the Likud party, the supporters of Netanyahu in Israel. And he made an alliance with a lot of these fanatical extremist groups that the US government has been backing around the world, right? Osama bin Laden at one point was supported by the United States to fight the Soviet Union. And that the policy of the USA around the world, in Syria and other places, has been cultivating fanatical extremists to do our fighting for us, to attack countries we don't like, whether it's Russia or China or Cuba or wherever. And the result of that has been these groups coming to the United States, setting up shop and pushing our politics in the United States to the right. And that is an important point. And Unification Church is a great example of that because, the Washington Times is a really big part of the Republican Party. They have a lot of influence in the Republican Party now. But this is a Korean religious right-wing extremist group that we cultivated in South Korea to fight against communism, brought them to the United States, and now they've shifted our politics. And right now in Ukraine, the US government is aligned and arming the government of Ukraine, which has neo-Nazis in it. It has the Azov Battalion, which is a group of people who admire Hitler and admire Hitler collaborators like Stepan Bandera. They just had a big parade in Ukraine to celebrate Stepan Bandera, this Nazi collaborator, a participant in the Holocaust. And, you know, at the UN, Russia put forward a resolution to condemn glorification of Nazism. And the United States was one of only a handful of countries to vote against it. The USA voted against a UN resolution condemning the glorification of Nazism. Why in the world are we voting against it? Because it's geopolitical, right? And that because our so-called allies in Ukraine are having parades in honor of Stepan Bandera. It's particularly outrageous. And, you know, the demonization of Russia kind of, it gets into this position where, again, the principles that our leaders claim to espouse kind of fall out the back of their heads the minute geopolitics is involved. And that's a really, really common pattern we've seen over and over and over again. It's worth pointing out. So there you go.
Thank you so much, Roger Meadows. No more corporations and political parties, only worker cooperatives and no parties. Thanks so much for that on Rockfin. There's a lot of fear mongering too, Caleb. I've noticed this as well. Like they just want Americans to be afraid of China. They're like, oh, China is scary and bad. We need to be afraid of them. And I'm like, why? Because they're doing well economically. Are we the only ones that are allowed to do that as a country?
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, look, China has pulled itself up by its bootstraps, and right now it has the biggest telecommunications manufacturer in the world. It's a worker cooperative called Huawei Technologies. It's a, you know, Harvard Business Review said it's one of the greatest examples of profit sharing working. It's a profit sharing cooperative business. It's a huge cell phone manufacturer called Huawei. And they make phones that last longer than iPhones do. They have better cameras than iPhones do. They're better phones. And so the US leaders that say they believe in free trade, right? Oh, we believe in free competition, free trade. What do? Do they say, okay, let the two companies compete? Oh, no. Mike Pompeo and now the Biden administration are going around the world telling countries not to do business with Huawei. It's illegal to import Huawei phones to the United States. And they say, oh, it's a threat to national security. I'll tell you what it really is. It's they make better phones. This is the US government protecting Apple and you know, trying to preserve the profits of an American corporation. That's all it really is. Because at the end of the day, Huawei phones are just better phones. They make better phones, and so as a result, we have the U.S. government trying to crush them and put Huawei technologies out of business.
Terrible. Caleb, thanks so much for coming on. This has been awesome. I learned a lot from you. Every time you come on, I learn so much.
It's always fun. It's always great to come on. You're doing great stuff on this channel. It's always a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Before you head out, where can people find you?
Oh, well, I'm on Twitter, just Caleb Maupin. I'm on YouTube, Caleb Maupin. I've got a website, CALEBMAUPIN, calebmaupin.com. You can check out the think tank, the Center for Political Innovation. Our website is cpiusa.org. Always a pleasure to interact with you and come on. You know, plenty to talk about. There you go.
Thanks so much. All right, guys. Everyone have a good weekend. You know how we do this. Have a good night. Keep up the fight.